Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
Do you know your true worth? Because I found out mine the day my parents said they were too tired to sit through my graduation, then posted photos getting my sister a massage. I had worked for years, sacrificed weekends, turned down parties, and kept my head down to make sure my grades stayed flawless, because in my head I thought that if I finally reached the top of my class, if I stood there as valedictorian, my family would have no choice but to see me. I imagined them in the front row, maybe even clapping the loudest, finally treating me as the daughter who had achieved something that mattered. Instead, what I got was a text that landed in my phone the night before my graduation, telling me they were exhausted and would not be able to make it, and that they would celebrate later at home. At first, I read it twice, thinking maybe I missed something, maybe they were joking, maybe there was some plan I didn't know about. But no, the text was clear and short, and it had that casual tone my mom always used when she wanted to make her excuses sound reasonable. My dad just echoed it with a thumbs up, like this was a group chat confirmation, not them skipping what should have been the most important day of my life so far. I sat on my bed staring at the screen, feeling my stomach twist, but I swallowed the words I wanted to write back. I told myself maybe they really were tired, maybe they needed rest, maybe I could live with them missing it if it was truly about their health. But then Kayla, my best friend, sent me a screenshot that shattered that fragile excuse into pieces. It was my mom, dad, and sister Jenna smiling in fluffy robes, champagne glasses in hand, with the caption, "Spa day with my favorite people." That was the moment when my disappointment hardened into something else. I had seen favoritism before, countless birthdays where Jenna's minor emergencies derailed the entire night, endless excuses for why her comfort came first, but this felt like proof carved in stone. They did not skip because they were tired. They skipped because Jenna wanted a pampering day, and they always found a way to justify her needs as more important than mine. I scrolled through the comments on the post, people saying things like family goals and you guys look amazing, and I felt this deep mix of nausea and clarity. They weren't exhausted. They were invested, just not in me. I kept quiet in the group chat, not out of weakness, but because something inside me shifted. For the first time, I didn't want to argue with them. I didn't want to beg them to show up, to guilt them into pretending they cared. I realized I had one card left to play, and it was bigger than any fight we could have had on the phone. Tomorrow, I would have the microphone, the stage, and an audience of hundreds. For once, they would not be able to spin it, because the truth would be mine to tell. That night, while they sipped champagne, I sat at my desk with my speech pulled up on my laptop. I had written something safe, something about resilience and the future, but suddenly it felt hollow. Why thank everyone and pretend my life was a storybook when the people who should have supported me most were wrapped up in towels at a spa? I started editing, not to create some dramatic takedown, but to insert just one line that would turn the mirror toward them. I wrote, "To everyone who showed up, thank you. And to everyone who didn't, I learned something important about worth today." It was short, sharp, and impossible to misinterpret. It didn't need their names. Everyone would know. Still, I didn't want to sit on that stage alone. So I reassigned my family's reserved seats. Instead of letting them sit empty, I put in requests through the school's ticket system and gave those spots to Professor Alvarez, the one teacher who had checked on me when I seemed overworked, and Aunt Denise, my mom's sister who never sugarcoated the truth and had already texted me that she would be in the audience no matter what. I even printed small paper cards to tape onto the chairs that said, "Reserved for those who showed up." It was petty, yes, but it was also precise. Lying in bed afterward, I thought about how this would play out. I pictured my parents scrolling their phones tomorrow, seeing the clips from my speech and realizing they had been called out not in a shouting match, but in front of everyone who mattered. I pictured Jenna's face when she realized she wasn't untouchable, that her spa day had a receipt and a consequence. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, a calm sense of control. I wasn't going to send them a warning or give them a chance to weasel out. I wasn't going to waste my energy arguing with them over text. Instead, I was going to let them sit with the consequences of their own choices. They wanted to skip my graduation? Fine. But their absence would not go unnoticed, and their version of events would no longer be the only one people heard. The next morning, as I zipped up my gown and looked at my speech one last time, I didn't feel scared. I felt steady. I felt like I had stopped begging to be seen and started showing myself on my own terms. They thought skipping my graduation would be another thing I would swallow quietly. But this time, I was ready to make sure the whole world knew the truth without me ever raising my voice. And that's when it hit me. I was about to stand at that podium, in front of my class, in front of the entire town, and slip in one single line that would cut deeper than any fight ever could. One line that they would never see coming, but everyone else would never forget. I walked into the auditorium with the kind of steadiness that only shows up when you have already survived the hardest part, because the hardest part was not the speech or the crowd or the cameras on tripods at the back of the room. It was the decision I had made the night before to stop buying the family's version of events and to let the truth stand on its own legs without me dressing it up to keep the peace, and as I checked that the small place cards were still taped to the chairs I had reassigned, one for Professor Alvarez and one for Aunt Denise, both already in their seats with the posture of people who take showing up seriously, I felt something like oxygen return to my chest, which told me I was ready to say what I had to say and accept whatever followed. The principal did the usual welcome. There were the expected jokes about the future and the gentle reminders to keep applause short, and while a few speeches before me blended together in that pleasant, forgettable way that happens at ceremonies where everyone is trying to be kind and nobody wants to risk saying anything real, I kept my copy of the speech folded to the exact page where my added line waited, not as a weapon, but as a boundary. Because a boundary is only a weapon to the person who benefits from you not having one. When my name was called and I moved to the podium, the room rose and settled again, and I could see Kayla near the aisle squeezing her program like a stress ball while Aunt Denise gave me a small nod that said, "Do not flinch," and I told myself I would not. So I began the way I had rehearsed, with gratitude that was honest and not performative, thanking the teachers who stayed late to answer questions and the classmates who turned competition into a reason to work harder instead of a reason to tear each other down, and then, as the rhythm took hold and the room leaned in, I pivoted into the line that had kept me awake and calm at the same time, the line that was going to change the temperature in the building. To everyone who showed up, I said, letting the words travel without rushing them, "Thank you for choosing to be here and for proving that support is something you do, not something you post." And then I breathed once and let the next sentence land the way a door clicks when you finally close it, and to everyone who did not show up, I learned something important about worth today. There was a silence that felt clean rather than awkward, the kind of quiet that happens when people decide to hear instead of react, and I did not dress the line with a smile or a shrug because it did not need accessories. And in that stillness I saw Professor Alvarez tilt his head with pride and Aunt Denise's eyes soften like she had been waiting years to watch me pick myself over the family story, while a local reporter near the front shifted her phone into a better angle and recorded without blinking, and all of this registered in a corner of my brain that was still paying attention to the speech itself, because I continued on as planned, talking about the value of showing up for the work when no one sees you, and for people who do not make demands you cannot meet, and for yourself when the easy choice would be to downgrade your needs to keep a peace that only exists if you are quiet. When I finished, the applause was neither wild nor polite. It was steady and sustained in a way that made me feel seen without turning the moment into a spectacle, and as I stepped down, the principal shook my hand with a look that said he had understood more than I had said out loud, while a guidance counselor whispered, "Well done," like she was handing me a final grade, and then I walked straight to the 2 chairs I had assigned, hugged my aunt and my professor longer than etiquette usually allows, and asked someone behind us to take a quick photo, not for social points, but because I wanted a record that the people who matter most were the ones who come when it counts. In the small chaos after the ceremony, while people wrestled with flowers and caps and the rush to the parking lot, I sent that short clip of the line to my family group chat with a message that was calm to the point of clinical, "You were mentioned." And then I put my phone in my bag and focused on the people who were present, on Kayla's tearful laugh that said relief and vindication at the same time, on Aunt Denise's "let them stew," and on the quiet permission I had given myself to enjoy something without asking whether my parents approved, until the phone buzzed in a way that told me they had heard me and wanted to pull me back into the old choreography where they make a mess and I mop it with diplomacy. My mother wrote first in that familiar tone that pretends to fix while actually blaming, telling me I had humiliated the family and that there were better ways to express disappointment. And then my father added a message about timing and maturity and not airing private matters in public, and finally Jenna dropped in like a meteor, saying I needed to delete the clip immediately because I was going to ruin everything she had lined up next week, which she described as extremely important and delicate and dependent on the family presenting a united front, and it was wild how the word united only showed up when they wanted me to eat my own truth for their optics, because where was united when I was measuring my gown alone and reassigning my seats? I typed slowly so I would not waste the moment with heat I did not need, and I wrote that I had not named anyone, that I had thanked those who came, that I had told the truth, and that I would not be deleting anything. And while my mother tried to pivot into a lecture about forgiveness and moving on, Jenna fired back with a message packed with urgency about sponsorship calls and collaborative content, and how brands hate anything messy, and how my speech was messing with her schedule. And I stared at the screen and realized that underneath every excuse and lecture and request for unity was the same simple math that had governed our family for years. The math that always added up to Jenna first and everyone else later. So I replied with a question that was not a trap but a flashlight, because I wanted them to hear themselves out loud. If I was supposedly about to ruin everything she had lined up next week, then what exactly was everything, and who had promised what? And why was my existence as a person with boundaries suddenly incompatible with her plans? And as I hit send, I felt that same clean quiet I had felt on the stage, because I knew I had just moved the conversation out of the fog of feelings and into the hallway of facts, where echoes make people hear what they are actually saying. Can you guess what happens when someone who has always relied on your silence suddenly needs your approval to keep a door open? Because that is the message that arrived next, and it was not an apology or a reconsideration. It was a name and a company and a request that I play along for the sake of the family's image, and that is where the next part of this gets interesting. The name that landed in my messages was not just a random contact or some vague opportunity wrapped in buzzwords. It was an actual person from an actual company that Jenna had been chasing for months. A mid-sized lifestyle brand that cared a lot about polished stories and friendly faces, and, according to her, a partnership that would finally prove she was more than the family's favorite project. And the message, which came from a human resources coordinator who was very clear and very polite, said that Jenna had listed me as a reference for reliability and collaboration, and that they would appreciate a brief conversation about her follow-through and character, which would have been funny if it were not so predictable. Because after an entire childhood of me staying late to finish her science posters and lending my account to submit her late assignments and covering for forgotten rides and panicked last-minute requests, here she was asking me, through a stranger, to keep the pattern alive in a way that looked professional and harmless. I sat with it for a full minute, not because I did not know what to do, but because I wanted to make sure my answer would be clean and factual rather than cathartic. Since the temptation when you have been the family fixer is to either blow up the whole house or to shrug and hammer the same crooked picture back onto the wall. So I opened a blank note and started building a one-page timeline that did not insult anyone's intelligence or rely on my opinion. It simply listed commitments and outcomes. And I pulled dates from my calendar and old emails and text threads, marking the times Jenna asked me to edit proposals that were due within hours, the rides I gave even when I had exams the next morning, the holiday that ended early because she needed new headshots for a last-second submission, and at the end of the page I added the graduation day line, not to be cruel, but to be honest, stating that while I cannot speak to her talent or potential brand value, I can confirm that when a commitment does not center her, she has a pattern of deprioritizing it and making other people absorb the fallout. Before I called the coordinator, I got an email from Ruth Bennett, the scholarship donor whose name still felt like a lifeline because she had looked me in the eye at a campus event and said that grit outruns gloss every time. And she wrote congratulations with such direct warmth that I found myself relaxing in the middle of all this family noise. And then she asked a simple question about how my family had celebrated, which landed like a small test I had not studied for. Because here was a person who did not owe me anything asking me to narrate the first page of my adult life, and I decided to answer with the same steady tone I had used in my speech, saying that my family was not present, that I celebrated with my aunt, a professor, and 2 friends, and that I learned a lesson about showing up that I would carry into whatever came next, and I hit send without decorating it to make anyone comfortable. Ruth replied within the hour, inviting me to a small luncheon with donors and fellows, a kind of room where introductions have long shadows. And she mentioned a fellowship that would pair me with a project I actually cared about rather than a name that would look good on a page, and that email felt like oxygen after a week of stale air. Because it told me that when you put the truth in the right rooms, it does not always explode, sometimes it plants. Then I returned to the human resources message, dialed the number, and kept my voice level as I confirmed basic facts about knowing Jenna, about growing up together, about having seen her work on various personal projects. And when the coordinator asked the reliability question in that careful corporate phrasing, I said that Jenna is exceptional at showing up for opportunities that center her image and tends to be inconsistent when the task requires sustained work that does not deliver immediate validation, and I gave 2 specific examples with dates and outcomes, including the graduation decision framed as a missed commitment rather than a family drama, and I said that while I cannot advise them on brand alignment, my experience suggests they should put any partnership terms in writing with clear deadlines and non-negotiable deliverables, because structure helps everyone succeed, which was both the kindest and most honest reference I could give. After the call, I sent Jenna a short message saying that I had spoken with the coordinator and had given a factual reference, which she read immediately without replying. And then my mother jumped in with a lecture about loyalty and family and how she could not believe I would jeopardize Jenna's future over a misunderstanding, which she still insisted was about exhaustion and not a spa appointment. And I thought about how loyalty in our house had always meant silence when Jenna needed an alibi, and applause when she needed a crowd, and how a misunderstanding was the word we used whenever the truth made someone look bad, and I decided I would not debate semantics with people who needed mislabeling to function. Instead, I opened my documents folder and finished the 1-page timeline, cleaned up the dates, attached the spa screenshot with the caption time visible, and printed it for myself like a small shield. Because I knew the spin cycle was about to accelerate and I needed to keep my own head clear, and as if on cue, Jenna finally responded with a long message that boiled down to an order wrapped in panic, telling me I had to, not should but had to, send a follow-up to the company clarifying that my speech was just theater and that I fully supported her partnership, because otherwise she would look like someone who could not manage her own life. And the way she wrote that last line told me she was used to dragging me back into the role of supportive prop whenever the plot started to wobble. So I wrote back that I would not be sending any follow-up because nothing I said needed correction, and I added that from now on I do not consent to my work, my speech, or my name being used in any of her pitches or content as a credibility booster. And I sent the same note to my parents so there would be no confusion about where I stood, and while their responses stacked up like flyers on a windshield, I closed the chat and looked at the calendar invite Ruth had sent for the luncheon, which felt like a door that opened because I stopped guarding one that always slammed on my face. The funny thing about setting a boundary is that the people who like you exhausted always hear it as an attack, so while they worked on a new script in which I was petty and ungrateful and dramatic, I booked a meeting with the campus financial office to review my accounts. Because the next round of revenge was not loud or flashy, it was structural, and it would cut off every quiet pipeline they had been using to treat my time and resources like a family fund, and by the time I clicked confirm on that appointment, I knew exactly which levers I would pull first. When I walked into the meeting with the campus financial office, carrying a folder thick with papers that I had spent the night organizing, I already knew what needed to happen, because for years my parents had treated my accounts, my credit, and even my name as if they were convenient extensions of their resources, and every time I had let it slide, telling myself that helping them or helping Jenna was temporary and harmless, I had slowly been building a structure where they benefited while I quietly carried the hidden costs, and now that structure was going to be dismantled piece by piece, not in anger, but in precision, because if there is one thing I had learned from their endless spin and excuses, it was that words can be twisted, but paperwork has teeth. I asked the officer to go through my student records, my billing accounts, and the emergency contacts line by line, and with each entry I removed my parents' access, because I no longer wanted them to have the ability to poke into my information, request adjustments on my behalf, or make calls that sounded like they were acting in my best interest when they were really smoothing Jenna's path. And while I signed form after form with a kind of calm intensity, I felt something like relief wash over me. The relief of knowing that even if they protested or tried to play the guilt card later, their reach would be structurally blocked, and the systems that had been so porous were now built with walls that only I controlled. From there I moved to my bank, closed the lingering joint account that had once been created under the excuse of lowering Jenna's car insurance payments, and while I transferred out the small balance, I thought about how many times over the years that account had been quietly drained for things that had nothing to do with me, and how I had let it go because fighting felt exhausting and saying no felt like picking a war I could not win. But as I signed the closure form, I realized that exhaustion had been the trap all along, because they wanted me tired enough to agree, and the only way to win was to refuse the game altogether. I called the phone company next, removed myself from the family plan that I had been paying into since I was a teenager, and set up a new line in my own name, and as the representative asked me if I wanted to transfer over any additional numbers, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, because for years my number had been the reliable one, the backup one, the one Jenna would put down when she didn't want to be bothered, but still needed someone to be reached in case of emergency, and now I was finally cutting that cord, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I wanted to live a life where my phone was not a hotline for their chaos. That evening, I signed the lease on a small apartment closer to the fellowship office that Ruth had told me about, and although the place was nothing glamorous, the act of putting down my name without their cosign felt like the most powerful declaration of independence I had ever made, because while my Aunt Denise showed up with pizza and a toolbox to help me clean and settle in, what mattered most was that I was no longer tethered to a house where my presence was optional and my achievements invisible unless they could be converted into Jenna's props. The next morning, I sent my parents an email that was short, formal, and written in the same tone you would use to a company that had missed an invoice, and in it I itemized the semester's expenses that they had promised to cover and never did, including fees for books, lab materials, and transportation, and at the end I gave them two options. They could either repay me directly in a clear repayment schedule, or they could make a donation of the equivalent amount to the scholarship fund in my name, with proof of receipt, and I wrote that this was not a request, but a closure of accounts, because I was no longer able to carry silent costs for a family that could not carry me for one day at my own graduation. Their replies came quickly and predictably, my mother insisting that money should not come between family, my father suggesting that I was escalating something that could have been resolved peacefully, and Jenna firing off a long message that accused me of trying to humiliate them in front of outsiders, and while the old me might have tried to soften the edges, to reframe the ask in a way that felt less sharp, the new me simply filed their responses into a folder labeled noise and did not reply, because I knew that boundaries without enforcement are just requests, and I was not requesting anymore. Of course, the timing of this structural cleanup collided with their desire to reassert control, and within 2 days I received a forwarded invitation from my mother for the donor luncheon that Ruth had mentioned, with a note saying, "We will attend as a family. Wear something tasteful, and we will present ourselves properly," as if my life was a stage set they could decorate when it benefited them, and while my fingers itched to type a scathing response, I paused and let the silence stretch. Because I realized that the most effective form of revenge was not to shout at them for misunderstanding me, but to calmly refuse the script they were trying to hand me, and to show up in that room on my own terms, with my own people, in a way that they could not edit or frame. So I wrote back one line, polite and firm, about that, and I closed my laptop because I had already decided that when the luncheon came, there would be no staged family photo, no pretense of unity, and no performance that erased the truth. Because for once in my life, I was going to make sure that the people who had shown up were the ones who were honored, and that the ones who had not would be standing on the outside, watching as the doors closed without them. When the day of the donor luncheon finally arrived, I walked into that hotel ballroom with a calmness that came not from denial or pretense, but from preparation, because by then I had already severed the hidden strings that my family used to pull at me. I had already created the boundaries that could not be smoothed away with guilt or charm, and I knew that this room, filled with donors, professors, community leaders, and the kind of people who quietly decide the shape of opportunities for years to come, was going to be the stage where I did not have to perform as the dutiful daughter anymore, but instead could stand as the person who had earned her own place without anyone else opening the door for her. I took my seat between Aunt Denise and Professor Alvarez, both of whom carried themselves with the simple dignity of people who did not need to embellish their role in my life, and as the waiters poured water and adjusted place cards, I noticed the subtle difference between being with people who show up because they want to and people who show up because they need something from the photo. The program moved quickly, short speeches and introductions, polite applause, the kind of social choreography that everyone understands, but nobody really says out loud, and when Ruth Bennett stood at the microphone to speak about the purpose of the scholarship, she gestured toward me and asked me to share one lesson that I was taking forward from the journey so far, and I rose without notes, not because I wanted to improvise, but because I knew that authenticity mattered more than polish in that moment, and I said clearly that the lesson I was carrying was simple, that showing up is an action and not a caption, that support is proven by presence and not by excuses, and that gratitude belongs to the people who do the work of being there rather than the ones who claim credit after the fact. The applause that followed was steady and warm, not explosive, but it told me the message had landed, and as I sat down, Ruth leaned over and whispered that this was exactly the kind of clarity she looked for in fellows, because clarity signals resilience, and resilience is what sustains people when the novelty of success wears off. At that precise moment, as if on cue, my parents walked in with Jenna trailing behind, late and polished, making sure to be noticed, because they still believed in the myth that arrival alone equals contribution. And they tried to merge into the photo line with the donors, smiling broadly as if they had been in the audience the entire time, but the staff glanced at me for direction. And I simply shook my head and said that photos should prioritize the mentors and supporters who had been present at the ceremony. It was polite, it was firm, and it was final. My mother's face tightened into that brittle mask she wore whenever she realized she was not in control of the narrative. My father shuffled as though he might try to argue but knew better than to create a scene in front of strangers. And Jenna muttered something about brand damage under her breath, but none of it mattered, because the moment they were excluded from the official photo was the moment their absence became publicly undeniable. Not just an awkward detail, but a documented reality. I could feel the balance of power shift in the quietest possible way, not with yelling or confrontation, but with the smooth mechanics of choice, because I had chosen who would stand next to me in the record, and they were not it. Then Ruth announced, with the ease of someone who had been planning this for weeks, that I would not only be awarded the fellowship, but would also have a small discretionary grant to direct toward a cause of my choosing, and, while polite claps circled the room, I took the microphone again and said that I wanted the grant directed to the Campus Fund for first-generation students who often navigate milestones alone, because nobody should have to choose between silence and invisibility when all they're asking for is basic support. The statement landed without drama but with weight, and as I returned to my seat, I could feel the eyes of my parents on me, full of a frustration that had nowhere to go, because they had no control left over the story. After the luncheon wrapped, my mother approached with a forced smile, asking for a family photo for appearances, my father adding that it would be wise to smooth things over, and Jenna insisting that one picture could save her weeks of work, but I politely declined. Not with anger, but with a calmness that made it impossible to argue, and instead I handed them copies of the graduation program, where I had highlighted the line from my speech that thanked those who showed up and addressed those who didn't, as if to remind them that the script had already been written and the chance to edit it had passed. They left shortly after, their polished image cracking at the edges, and I felt no urge to chase them down or to soften the blow, because for once the consequences belonged fully to them. The final act of revenge came not in words, but in paperwork, the kind they would not be able to ignore. I had taken the invoice I had sent for the unpaid semester expenses, converted it into a donation receipt made out in my name, and handed it to Ruth during the luncheon with the simple request that the public program list the gift under, in honor of everyone who shows up. When the program was distributed and my parents saw their failure turned into a permanent line item of recognition they could never claim as their own, their expressions told me that they understood, maybe for the first time, that I had stopped carrying their weight and started building my own structure. Later that night, Jenna texted me in a fury, saying that I had made her look bad, that I had ruined her chances, that I had crossed a line, and I replied with one final message that closed the loop. I did not make you look like anything. I just stopped covering it. Then I blocked the family group chat and changed my emergency contact to Aunt Denise, because I knew that moving forward, the only people who would be allowed in were the ones who had already proven they knew how to stay. And as I sat in my apartment, the lease signed, the locks mine, the boundaries drawn with actual teeth instead of wishful thinking, I realized that the final switch had not been about revenge in the petty sense, but about control. About shifting the narrative from their performance of family unity to my reality of chosen support, and that even though there might always be a part of me that wondered if they would ever change, the truth was that I had already changed. And the victory was mine not because I had hurt them, but because I had finally stopped letting them hurt me.